You end up discovering new stuff because of that. So it actually kind of cuts both ways. It could be, yes, cherry picking what you report, cherry picking and falsifying stuff, which is the very bad way to do it. This is the very bad side of things. You do have jerks that do that. All of this one, for example. So, first things up before I forget. Not quite finished with the Heterodox Academy stuff yet, so I think that'll end up coming next week. Circumstances beyond my control, I couldn't finish up with it. My apologies for that, but next week. Oh, and by the way, the Rogue Journal Club will be returning soon too. We're going to be recording another episode next week. I think it may have something to do with gas stoves. Stay tuned for that one. But some of you may have heard this news recently, and the College Fix has a good article about some of the broader issues, but also the larger, the larger problem of one particular professor recently, and so I'll show that. But I wanted to use this as an opportunity to jump off into a brief discussion because things being as muddled as they are in today's world, it bears a good thing to remind what is actually meant by reproducibility in science and replication in science also. So the recent news being about a professor who has recently left their position at Florida State University over accusations of serious accusations of research misconduct, bordering on outright fraud, if not being outright fraud. Concern over academic, and this has prompted articles like this one, but here's the actual one on the specific professor. Prominent professor accused of falsifying racism data leaves university. The co-author of his work wrote that fraud was most likely explanation for data irregularities. Prominent Florida State University criminology professor Eric Stewart left his job after allegedly faking results in at least 6 studies about American crime to make racism seem worse than it is. Professor Stewart's 16-year FSU career appears to have ended, signaled by his abrupt March 2023 absence, the Florida Standard reported. His sudden, unexplained replacement may indicate the looming end of the investigation with enough evidence of fraud to justify his termination. So, most recently, editors found that Stewart manipulated data in a 2011 study published in the academic journal Criminology to inaccurately show that Black and Hispanic populations grew, the surrounding white populations wanted more racially discriminatory sentencing, which would be one heck of a fraud right there. If true, obviously we're waiting for the investigation to finish. Let's see. The study, Ethnic Threat and Social Control, examining public support for judicial use of ethnicity in punishment, was retracted on December 12th, 2019, according to the Wiley Online Library. The above article, published online May 25th, 2011 in Wiley Online Library, has been retracted at the request of the authors and by agreement with the journal editors and Wiley Periodicals Incorporated. The second author, Eric A. Stewart, in the course of responding to concerns raised with data and analysis, identified a mistake in the way the original data were merged. The third author, Justin Pickett, also requested retraction. He has publicly stated his view that the identified discrepancies are not attributable to researcher error. The Florida Standard stated in the original data no relationship was found between growing minority populations and demands for increased sentences. If anything, Pickett pointed out it was quite the opposite. So, that is the accusation here, not just for this article. 5 other criminology studies connected with this particular professor have also been retracted. So, and it is a concern. So, just one of the things to make a point of this. This is not to say that all scientists do this. Of course not. That is not the case. But it is horrifically bad, and it is frowned upon highly when it does happen. But the case with Professor Stewart has resulted in a couple of other articles like this one that come out not just from the College Fix, but actually from several publications and news discussions and what have you. Concern over academic research fraud grows after scholar cooked data on racism. A Florida State University criminology professor left his job recently. This week, the College Fix also reported on a diversity, equity, inclusion paper from the University of Minnesota's Health Services Department that has been retracted for misrepresenting the authenticity of experiences cited. So there is a lot of that. Now, I don't know that I would agree with the notion, as is said here by the National Association of Scholars, that research misconduct in the form of outright fraud is pretty common. However, what I do not disagree with in this, at least in terms of what I've experienced and the people that I've worked with, I find it to be very uncommon. My experience is anecdotal, put it to that way bluntly. Because he claims down here that there was a claim down here that the National Association of Scholars released a report in 2018 on the issue, faulting flawed statistics, faulty data, deliberate exclusion of data, and political groupthink for some of the research fraud. Now, this is important to key in there as a key word, which the report found is prevalent in academia. The problem is referred to as irreproducibility, meaning researchers who seek to replicate the results of studies cannot do so in many cases, according to the NAS report. Some of this comes to light when other researchers attempt to replicate another researcher's published findings and discover that the other researcher's claims fall apart. Now, this is one of the reasons we do so highly and so often do replication. It's one of the reasons we do peer review, though it certainly doesn't always get caught in peer review like it should. But it is also the reason for continued challenging and pushbacks and what have you. And that is a good thing. However, I want to point out the issue with reproducibility and replication is, just to also make a point here, reproducibility and replication of an experiment are not exactly the same thing. Let me go over here to the National Academies of Science. Reproducibility and replicability are commonly used terms in the scientific community. However, some fields use the terms interchangeably or even use the terms with opposing definitions. The committee that wrote the report, so this is a part of a particular feature from 2019, the committee that wrote the report said it's important to distinguish these terms to unravel the complex issues associated with confirmation of previous studies. Reproducibility is defined as obtaining consistent results using the same data and code as the original study, synonymous with computational reproducibility. Replicability means obtaining consistent results across studies aimed at answering the same scientific question using new data or other new computational methods. So, in this case, what you're talking about with reproducibility is if I take somebody else's code, if I take somebody else's analysis, even if I take, let's say, the methods that are written up in a paper, because pre the days of code sharing, that's how you would do it. Pre the days of being able to share computer code and data directly, that's how you would do it. You would go talk to the guy, get the data they were using from them directly, and then you would repeat their methods as based upon the available write-up in the journal article or in correspondence or something like that. You'd go back and forth and do it that way. You should get the same result or near the same result. And the reason I say near the same result, because this is a fun thing about computers. If you run something that is programming analysis on one computer, you will not necessarily get the exact perfect identical result on a different computer with the same code and the same data. Why is that? It's called machine precision. Not every computer chip, not everything with that, has the same level of machine precision. What is machine precision? Generally speaking, it is like 10 to the minus 16th or something like that. It is an extremely tiny number. So for all practical purposes, yes, they're identical. They're absolutely identical. But not perfectly identical in the sense that you would have to get, the way to get it perfectly identical would be to run it with the exact same computer. So yes, what they mean by consistent results with the same data and code is they recognize the issue that computers have different levels of machine precision to them. And that's exactly the issue there. Replicability, consistent results. So let's say I take data from some other location here, and maybe the same code, but a different data set from a different location. And I'm studying the same physical question, but I'm looking at it in a different location, and I set up the experimental design exactly the same, I should get a consistent result. Not the same result because it's a different location, it's a different data set, it's a different time period perhaps, but a consistent result in the sense of the physical question. What do I mean by that? Consistent result in the fact that, okay, yeah, I've set up this experiment and I know temperature decreases with elevation as you go uphill, but I did it here in the southern Rockies or what have you, so it's warm, and how does it change when you get close to a coastline or something like that? So I take data from, say, the Pacific Northeast or the Northeast or something like that, and I set it up there, and I run the same experiment. Oh, and I find, oh yeah, the temperature does decrease with elevation. It's just colder up here because I'm closer to the poles in a northern latitude. Same physical thing is going on. Consistent result. It's a replicable thing, but you don't get exactly the same result for that reason. Consistent results across different studies, also using new data, new computational methods if I had a different computational method to do it, but I still ended up with the same result from a physical sense. That would be the case there. With social science, it's tougher in the sense that it is also somewhat dependent upon the social context. What do I mean? What's going on at place and time? Which group of people did you get from where? Kind of thing. If you're getting the same group of, sorry, the cats just went running by. If you're getting people out of the same pool, you can probably get something that's pretty consistent. But this has to do with like the same things of what's the consistent difference, the difference between the middle of the United States versus New York City, for example. You may get some very different results in behaviors and what have you with the same thing because of social context around where somebody is, grows up, what's going on in that local region, some of those kinds of things that are difficult to account for across multiple studies. You try and get it as consistent as you can. It's the replication there. None of those things are somewhat negative. So one typically expects reproducibility in computational results, but expectations about replicability are more nuanced. A successful replication does not guarantee the original scientific results of a study were correct, nor does a single failed replication conclusively refute the original claims. Several factors can contribute to non-reproducibility and non-replicability, including previously unknown variation or effects, inadequate record keeping, technology limitation, potential biases, lack of training, institutional barriers, or even misconduct. It is hard to quantify the extent of non-reproducibility or how much of science is reproducible. And while reproducibility and replicability are important for research, they are not the be-all, end-all, the committee emphasized. The goal of science is not to compare or replicate studies, but to understand the overall effect of a group of studies and the body of knowledge that emerges from them. I don't necessarily agree with that sentiment there, but because replication and reproducibility are important to finding out if you're, if it's repeatable and repeatedly repeatable and you keep getting something that is a very consistent result, that's what takes it from moving from the realm of just a random idea to a theory that might be replicable somewhere else, to scientific theory, and eventually from scientific theory to something a bit more solid in here. That's kind of replication and seeing it over and over again is what builds a natural consensus in a scientific discipline where, oh, yeah, I keep seeing that, you keep seeing that. That's got to be a real thing, and this is probably physically why. Where it comes in differently, where you're talking about previously unknown variations or effects, that's where the replication becomes important also, because if you replicate a study, or you replicate the methods of a study as much as you can somewhere else, and suddenly it doesn't work right, there's an unknown variation or effect that's there. That's not necessarily a negative. That's science doing its thing, really, is what it is. You're finding out new knowledge at the same time. And what they're saying here with the group of studies makes sense from the standpoint of, if one of those studies identifies something that is unknown, it does add to the body of knowledge. It does push us in the direction of finding the truth more. Push us more in the direction of finding the truth. Excuse me, it's been a long freaking day. But that's why I want to make the point here that this is important here. Because some of this is just that. It's a thing that you didn't know about. And so you're going back through and, okay, why is that? And it ends up, that's how you end up bringing about, obviously, new information, potentially new theories, all those kinds of things like that. There are limitations in technology that sometimes you just can't. The other thing, of course, is, lack of training. How do you do this kind of work of stuff? Proper experimental design. How do you go about replicating a study? That is there too. That's not necessarily malicious. Sometimes an institutional barrier. Yes, if you can't get what you need to replicate a study. Here's what I mean by that. There are some countries that consider some things like weather data, for instance, as matters of national security. It is difficult to get a hold of that data to be able to replicate it. There's nothing for it with that one. That is, again, not necessarily malicious, but things like that do happen. The misconduct issue is the one that grabs the most attention, because, as I kind of hinted at last week in recordings, scientists do have a place of trust, and Pielke and Burgess talked about this when I reviewed that last week. They do have a place of trust that is sometimes foolishly taken for granted, not naively, but foolishly taken for granted. And not being careful with the misconduct part and the fraud part of it is among the many things that degrades the trust in scientists. Now, for me personally, being in this, that one particular professor in this instance, if the investigation has concluded and found that they committed serious research misconduct and academic fraud, doubt they'll be working very much longer. Well, no, I mean, he's already left his job at Florida State, but to make the point, as we wrap up here, misconduct, yes, we do take it seriously. And I will say, this is not just a thing that is taken seriously, in like the College Fix or the New York Post or something like that when it comes up. You do see the issue of reproducibility and replicability come up into other things here. And that would be in here. It comes up quite frequently with Nature in discussions. Science has talked about it here. And yeah, one of the ways they've been talking about how to do reproducibility in psychology experimentation, for instance, is you gotta have detailed plans and what have you. Here, I can throw them a bone as to why this might be not necessarily the best thing here. Not necessarily work as well as they thought it was going to be. Sometimes you get into the middle of an experiment and your detailed plan, thing that you spent forever working up before you start the experiment, won't work because you find out something you didn't know before. So you got to be able to revise the plan and remember to keep good records. This is one of the things that makes science possible and makes it what it is the notion that you're keeping very damn good records of what you're doing. And not falsifying documents, as it were. In the same vein, this comes to us from Nature.
Is there a reproducibility crisis in science? Nature asked 1,500 researchers this question as part of an online survey. Half agreed there's a significant crisis, and many more identified a slight crisis. Science moves forward through corroboration, when researchers verify others' results. But 70% of researchers who took our survey said they'd tried and failed to reproduce another group's experiments. And even when trying to reproduce their own work, just over half said they couldn't. Does this mean that most published research is wrong? Our respondents don't think so. Most still trust published results in their field, with physicists and chemists the most confident. There are many reasons why researchers may fail to reproduce results. Sometimes a small difference like shaking or stirring a sample can lead to different outcomes. But the biggest reason, according to our survey, is selective reporting. Things like cherry-picking data to support a pet hypothesis. To get to grips with reproducibility, we need better mentorship, proper use of statistics, and more robust experimental design. All these approaches got ringing.
So one thing I want to say right here, and this is why I stopped the video, is I actually agree. This is one thing, I've harped on it for a while, like teaching the philosophy of science, it hasn't happened in undergraduate education of scientists. And I don't know that it's happened all that much in graduate education of scientists in the last, say, 20-odd years. This is stuff that needs to be taught if you're going into the scientific field, and it includes things like this. What is reproducibility? What is replicability? How do you make sure as much as possible that somebody else, if you give them your study, primarily if you give them your study, can reproduce your results? That is something that needs to be taught quite a lot here. And I don't think it's taught half as much. Then again, I have no data on that because I don't know that anybody's actually run, the analysis to say, this is how many institutions actually teach things like philosophy of science and mandate it for their science disciplines alongside of things like, reproducibility, how to construct good experimental design, all those kinds of things that we're talking about here. Proper use of statistics, because sometimes it is bad use of statistics. The other thing I want to say, although maybe I'll let this video finish first.
Endorsements in our survey. Whether it's a crisis or not, right now lots of people are paying attention to reproducibility. That makes it a good time for everyone, funders, publishers, scientists, and the institutions they work for, to act. Read more and delve into the...
Okay, they didn't get into it any further. The one thing I want to add, actually, to what they're saying here is not just the training and statistics and experimental design and things like that, but how to write a good methods section. So when I've reviewed papers on this channel, you've heard me say it many times. One of the things I harp on, and will always harp on, is the methodology section. Why? For one thing, if you have a method that doesn't really support the conclusions that you're making, you're doing an analysis on one thing, but you're trying to conclude something about something else, that is one of the ways you can pick out that a conclusion is just not all that good compared to what the authors actually said. The other reason is because if I want to go reproduce that study, the methods have to be clear enough that I can reproduce it down to the last detail. Or I can replicate it down to the last detail with some other data. That's the tricky challenge. And oftentimes we're trying to get around this more now by making sure like the data is available. And if you see, a bunch of journals now actually have data availability statements, code availability statements that are required, particularly if they're in the computational side of things, that are required in those journals so that another scientist could come ask you for your data and your code at any time, say, oh, I want to reproduce this. Can you give me this? Yes, and it would be just good courtesy to share. That's not necessarily discussed too much either with respect to the sciences, but it needs to be reminded. So that's one of the things I want to mention is one of the reasons I harp on the methods section and not just reading the results of the conclusion is making sure the conclusions are supported by the methods. but also making sure that the methods themselves can be reproduced or replicated elsewhere. So, just to wrap this all up and make a point. Yes, you do have some bad instances of fraud that do happen. That is not the only reason why. The fraud part is the bad reason why, for sure. But it is not the only reason why you have issues with replication. Sometimes with scientific studies. So don't necessarily jump to the conclusion that it's all because of something fraudulent. It's often not. Sometimes it's just because we're people and sometimes we forget to record things. This happens. And that's probably what happened for those scientists who couldn't replicate their own experiments. If they're coming back to it years later and they're trying to do it when they forgot to write something down that's kind of crucial, that's a big reason why. That's just out of being human. So be careful with it when you get some of these news reports that are basically talking about issues over academic research fraud. Not to say it doesn't exist. It certainly does exist. Fraud certainly does exist. But it's not the only thing that can cause replicability and reproducibility issues. And that's been a hot topic in science for a while, because like this is 2016, this is 2016, this is 2019. This thing here, I don't know when it was exactly. Cell biology, I think. I don't know when it exactly was, but there's many, many, many things on this going back for quite a while. So it's not an unknown issue. Do we still trust the results? Yes. One of the reasons folks may still trust the results, even if they can't 100% replicate it, is because they recognize the human issue with, noting things down, but they also recognize, I can't replicate it. Maybe there's something else going on here that I need to dig into, that may be somewhat unique to my situation or to the data that I have. Things like that do happen too. You end up discovering new stuff because of that. So it actually kind of cuts both ways. It could be, yes, cherry picking what you report, cherry picking and falsifying stuff, which is the very bad way to do it. This is the very bad side of things. You do have jerks that do that. All of this one, for example. But that is not always the reason why. So that's just one thing I wanted to make a point on, because reproducibility is an important thing, and you do your damnedest to make sure that somebody else can reproduce your study if they're given the same data and the same code, or replicate it if they're taking it elsewhere. That's it, folks. Thanks so much. Thanks so much. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way out the door. Comment on the video. Share the video. Subscribe to the channel. All that lovely good jazz. Until next time, I'm Adrian. May you stay curious, everybody.